As you guys get all the stuff that comes in your mailing, you're going to have a stapled together setup. And one of those formulas that's in that setup is this page here. This is a large printout of something that we would glue in the book. It's a 9-step format for dwelling service calculations. We're going to go through the book and highlight certain pieces that you have to know in order to use this 9-step format. Certain things you have to know before you can do a load calculation, a dwelling unit service calculation. It's in the code book and it's hidden. So we're going to turn to Chapter 2, Article 210, Part 11. We're going to go to the dwelling unit specific, which is C. And we're going to take our light color highlighter and highlight the dwelling unit specific part, 210.11C. And we've got 5 different pieces here. The first piece says small appliance branch circuits. So highlight small appliance. In addition to the number of branch circuits required by other parts of this section, highlight 2. It says 2 or more, so highlight 2 or more. And then I take the dark color highlighter and highlight 20 amp. Shall be provided for all receptacles outlets specified by 210.52b. Now 210.52b, we're not going to go there, but that is the layout, how many receptacles you require based on a layout of the floor line in a dwelling unit. Our number 2 there is laundry branch circuits, so highlight the word laundry. In addition to the number of branch circuits required by other parts of this section, at least 1. So highlight 1. It says additional and highlight 20 amp with dark color. It says branch circuits shall be provided to supply the laundry receptacle outlets required by 210.52f. It goes on to say this circuit shall have no other outlets. So light color highlight no other outlets. And at the top of the page, I always would write required, because certain things are required and you're required to know that they're required. It doesn't say we might ought to, or it'd be a good idea. It says no, these are required. It says that by saying the words or stating the words shall. Now we're going to go to a different section. We're going to go to Article 310.12 table. This table says single phase dwelling services and feeders. We're going to take our dark color highlighter, we're going to box this table in, just make it pop off the page. And what this does, this table is going to be referenced at the end. Okay, if we've got a service or feeder, rating in amps, it's going to have us a list from 100 all the way to 400. It's going to tell us what size wire, whether it's copper or aluminum. It's a simple reference table. Now the next section we're going to go to, before we get into actually doing any math, we're going to go to 430.248. And this is our motor section. 430.248 is full load currents and amps for single phase alternating current motors. So we're going to box this table in, make it jump off the page as well. When we're dealing with a motor, we're going to go back here to find the ampacity of that particular motor. Now we're going to go through the 9-step setup we talked about earlier, and we're going to go to where we're going to be talking about. So we're going to go to 220.12J for step 1, and we're going to actually label it as step 1. Highlight the J, dwelling units. In 1 family, 2 family, and multifamily dwellings, the minimum load shall be not less than 3 volt amps per square foot. So highlight 3 volt amps per square foot. The lighting and receptacle outlets specified in 220.14J1, J2, and J3 are included in the minimum unit load. Just for understanding that, I would highlight receptacle outlets and then highlight included in the minimum unit load. People get confused about that. The reason why that is, in a dwelling unit application, the 3 VA per square foot includes all the receptacles in that living space area. In a commercial application, the reason why that's confusing, you actually count for every receptacle as a load. In dwelling units, it's accommodated by the 3 VA per square foot. So beside that, write step number 1 for J. So it's 3 VA per square foot, which is exactly what our setup says. Step 1, 3 VA. To go on with this J, we need to know about that floor area and how that's measured and what it includes and what it doesn't include. And it refers us to 220.11, which is over here. 220.11 says floor area, so let's highlight floor areas. It says a floor area for each floor shall be calculated from the outside dimensions. So highlight outside dimensions. We do not care what how thick the wall is, which is a trick that some of the test providers for the state exams use. They'll tell you how thick a wall is. It doesn't matter. We're talking about the outside dimensions other building or dwelling unit, or other area involved. The dwelling units, the calculated floor area shall not include, so dark color highlight shall not include open porches, garages, and then down at the bottom it says unfinished spaces, not adaptable for future use. And that's kind of important because if you've got an unfinished basement, that's not what it's talking about, because you can finish that basement. But if you got an old attic space that will never be used or never be finished, or something that will never be a finished space possible, that's what it's talking about. So we don't include porches, and we don't include garages, and we don't include spaces that can't be adapted for future use. Step 2, it says 220.52. It says small appliances, and it tells us in the step-by-step format, 2 of them at a 1500 VA, and then a laundry at a 1500 VA. So let's look at 220.52. And 220.52 is in 2 steps. We got the first part, we got A, then we got B. So highlight small appliance, and then highlight laundry in the title block. And then part A, highlight small appliance. And it says, in each dwelling unit, the load shall be calculated at 1500 VA for each 2-wire small appliance branch circuit. So highlight 1500 VA. As covered by 210.11C1. That's where we know that there's 2 of them required. And then it says where the load is subdivided through 2 or more feeders, the calculated load for each shall include not less than 1500 VA for each 2-wire small appliance branch circuit. These loads shall be permitted to be included in the general lighting load and subjected to the demand factors. Highlight subjected to the demand factors, because that's important on this calculation. Then we go to the laundry circuits. Highlight laundry circuit. It says a load of not less than 1500 VA, volt amps, highlight 1500 volt amps. It says shall be included for each 2-wire laundry branch circuit installed as covered by 210.11C2. And C2 requires us to have at least 1. This load shall be permitted to be included in the general lighting load and shall be subjected to the demand factors. Highlight subjected to demand factors. Again, it's very important to know that. Now we're going to actually label this step number 2, and we're going to say that 2 small appliances are required and 1 laundry is required. So as where we can fit it in the small appliance section, we're going to write 2 required, and where we can fit it in for the laundry, we're going to say 1 required. In our test question, it's not going to say, generally speaking, that you have 2 small appliance branch circuits. It's going to say we've got a house or we've got a dwelling unit. Figure out the load. You've got to know that there's 2 small appliance branch circuits required and there's 1 laundry circuit required. Now we're going to talk about step 3. Step 3 says table 220.42 says apply lighting demands to steps 1 and 2. Okay, so we're going to go to this 220.42 lighting load demand factors. Now this table tells us for dwelling units, the type of occupancy, the first 3,000 is at 100, that's percent. And then from 3,001 to 120,000, we're at 35, and that's percent. So that's how we use this table. We take our first and second steps, we add them up because our second step says we can apply this demand factor to that. So our square foot, step 1, 3 VA per square foot, whatever that equals based on the square foot. Then our 2 small appliances and our laundry, we add all that up as a total, and then we apply this table. This table says 100% of the first 3,000, 35% of anything above 3,000 up to 120,000. So at the top of that, write step number 3. And just to put steps 1, 2, and 3 in perspective, the first 3 steps is what most test providers of state exams expect you not to be able to understand or know, especially knowing that there's 2 small appliance and 1 laundry circuit required, and that those get to be demanded in this step number 3. Now we're going to go back to our step-by-step format and we're going to look at step number 4. And step number 4 takes us to a piece in the code that doesn't have a whole lot to speak on, but we're going to look at it. But it says 220.60, and it says compare heat against AC and omit the smaller. So let's turn to 220.60 and we'll highlight non-coincident loads. And we'll read what it says. It says where it is unlikely that 2 or more non-coincident loads will be used simultaneously, it shall be permissible to use only the larger load or loads. That will be used at one time for calculating the total load of the feeder or service. Then it says where a motor is part of the non-coincident load and is not the largest of the non-coincident loads, 125% of the motor load shall be used in the calculation if it is the largest motor. So at the top of this, we'll take our pen and write step number 4, and then I'll just write heat versus AC, because really that's what we're talking about. You shouldn't have the heat going at the same time you got the air conditioning going, and that's what this code is referencing. Step number 5, don't get confused on step number 5. It takes us to 220.53. It says 75% demand factor for 4 or more fixed appliances. If we got 3, 2, or 1, that does not apply. It's 100%. So let's look at 220.53. Highlight appliance load. Once you get that, go ahead and write step number 5. It says appliance load. 220.53 says dwelling units. It shall be permissible to apply demand factor 75%. Highlight 75%. It says to the nameplate rating of 4 or more. Highlight 4 or more. That's important. We do not get to take this 75% if it's less than 4. It says appliances rated a quarter horsepower or greater or 500 watts or greater that are fastened in place. Highlight fastened in place, because we're not talking about your microwave, your coffee pot, things of that nature. We're talking about things that are fixed. But more specifically, it goes on to say, and that are served by the same feeder or service in 1 family, 2 family, or multifamily dwellings. The demand factor shall not apply to. So dark color, I highlight shall not apply to. So we've got things we cannot use even though we know they're appliances. And we got a list of 4. It says household electric cooking equipment. So light color, highlighted cooking equipment. Number 2 says clothes dryers, highlight dryers. Number 3 says space heating equipment, highlight heating. Number 4 says air conditioning equipment, highlight air conditioning. So we know those things are large appliances or could be considered large appliances, and we can't use them in this ideal. So to help you understand what this is talking about, when you say fixed, that means it's big, bulky, heavy, or connected. We have to have tools to remove it. Now let's go to step number 6. Step number 6 takes us to 220.54, and it says dryers 5 kW minimum, and it says table 220.54 demand for 5 or more. Well, if we're talking about a single family dwelling unit, we're not going to have 5 dryers, right? That'd be more for a multi-family dwelling unit or some type of apartment complex. It says specifically here that neutral demand is 70%. So far, everything we've been talking about has been a demand on these steps. But for a dryer, you get to take a 70% of the total load specific to the neutral conductor only. 220.54 takes us, again, we're not jumping around, it's all right here together. Highlight electric clothes dryers and write step number 6 beside it. It goes on to say electric clothes dryers, dwelling units. The load for electric clothes dryers in a dwelling unit or units shall be either highlight 5,000 watts or volt amps. Highlight volt amps, because watts and volt amps according to this part of the code are the same. We're not going to differentiate watts and volt amps. It says or the nameplate rating, whichever is larger. Highlight nameplate and then highlight whichever is larger. The important part here is no matter what the nameplate says, we're going to account 5,000 unless the nameplate says more than 5,000. If we have a 3,000 watt nameplate, we're still going to put it into our calculation 5,000. Doesn't matter. So to help that understanding for your knowledge to use this code book, down at the bottom we got a little blank area, write 5,000 minimum. Then we're going to go to step number 7. We're going to table 220.55. It says demand for cooking equipment, and it also tells us that the neutral is 70%, just like it is on the dryer. So table 220.55 takes up a whole page. Go ahead and write at the very top of the page step number 7. And then after you write step number 7, write column C. And we'll talk about why we wrote column C up there in just a moment. The title of this table says table 220.55, says demand factors for loads for household electric range, wall-mounted cooking ovens or wall-mounted ovens, counter-mounted cooking units, and other household cooking appliances over 1 3/4 kW rating. And then it says in parentheses, which we'll highlight, column C is to be used in all cases. Then it says except as otherwise permitted in note 3. So unless we're done with note 3, we're going to be using column C. So take the dark color highlighter and we're going to segregate this line here to make column C kind of stand alone. We're also going to take our pen and over here where it's got the numbers 8, 11, 14, 17, 20 and write KW there. Because KW stands for kilowatts, that means 1,000 watts. So 8 there represents 8,000 watts, 11,000 watts. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about note number 1 down at the bottom. The reason why we're going to talk about note number 1 is because if you look at column C says maximum demand KW. It says C notes if we got problems here. What I mean by that is it says C notes because column C is only for not over 12 kW. What if we've got something more than 12 kW, one range or a group of cooking units that's over 12 kW? So the way that column C works is if we've got one appliance and that's 12 kW or less, we're going to put in our calculation 8 kW. If we got more than 12 kW, we're going to have to see the notes. So let's look at note number 1 down at the bottom, where it says over 12 through 27. So highlight over 12 through 27 kW. It says range is all the same rating. If we're talking about a single family dwelling unit, you're probably only going to have one range in the single family dwelling unit. For ranges individually rated more than 12 but not more than 27, the maximum demand in column C, highlight column C, shall be increased 5% for each additional kilowatt rating, highlight 5%, of each additional kilowatt rating or major fraction thereof by which the rating of the individual range exceeds 12. Highlight exceeds 12, and then we'll take the dark color highlighter and highlight increased in front of the 5%. So this is a little mathematical deal to basically increase the numbers on column C. So if we got more than, let's say we had a 13 kW range, for an example. What we would do is take note number 1, where it says we're going to increase 5% for each additional kilowatt rating or major fraction thereof above or exceeding 12. So that's 5% increase. So the 8 would then be increased by 5% because for one appliance, the number is 8 if it's 12 or less. But since it's more than 12, by my example saying 13, we take 8 and multiply it by 5% increase, or increase it by 5%. Multiple different ways you can do that. One simple way on a calculator is to multiply 8 times 1.05. Step number 8 takes us to 220.50. It says largest motor to be increased by 25%. Let's go to 220.50. Highlight 220.50. It says motors. Beside it, write step number 8. And this takes us on a journey. That's what it does. And a lot of the code references do that. It says motor load shall be calculated in accordance with 430.24, 430.25, and 430.26, and with 440.6 for hermetic refrigerant motor compressors. We're going to highlight the 430.26. So go 430.26. 430.26 tells us feeder demand factor. Well, we're talking about sizing a service or feeder, so this correlates with what we're talking about. It says where reduced heating of conductors results from motors operating on duty cycle intermittently, or from all motors not operating at one time, the authority having jurisdiction, that's another name for the inspector, may grant permission for feeder conductors to have an ampacity less than that specified in 430.24, provided the conductors have sufficient ampacity for the maximum load determined in accordance with the sizes and number of motors supplied by the character of their loads and duties. Let's go to 430.24. 430.24 says conductors supplying several motors or motors and other loads shall have an ampacity not less than the sum of each of the following. The first one, number 1, says 125% of the full load current rating of the highest rated motor as determined by 430.6a. So this side journey, this side quest, just tells us that 125% of the largest motor is required. So we're going to go back to our 220.50 area, our step number 8, and we're just going to write that in because rather than taking that side quest, we're just going to write increase the largest by 125%. The reason why I say 25% larger because we're going to include the 100% in one of the other steps. We're just going to kick it 25% more in this step number 8. Now to our last step, which kind of throws all this together, comes up with a sum, and we figure out the size of the service required. It does take us around a couple different places. It says size the service by dividing the total VA. That's all steps 1 through 8. Add them up. Come up with total VA and divide it by the voltage, and then apply 310.12 table. So let's go to 310.12 table. and we'll label that step number 9. The next piece of this takes us to another part of the code. It says, all right, once we've sized the service, now we've got to size the grounding electroconductor. We're going to go to table 250.66. Now this table is a grounding table, grounding electroconductor table. And this is based on the size of the conductor that we chose. For many reasons we're going to be using this table. Let's box this table in with a dark color. We've got 4 different columns. We're going to split it right down the middle. Let's say, for example, we had a 200 amp service. 200 amp service for copper would be what? 2-aught copper. And then for 2-aught copper, we'd go to this table. And what size grounding electroconductor for copper would be number 4. It's a simple reference once you establish the service size, conductor size.